All right, good people, let's make it happen. So like I mentioned last time we talked, this whole series is about getting into the web in a more practical way, right? Full stack requires us to understand both the front end and the back end, and we're kind of diving into the front end. And so in the last session, I was talking a lot about the beginnings of the front end. We took a look at the first web page that we've ever seen, right? The one created by Sir Tim Berners-Lee and his team to describe what the web was. And we started working on creating our own web page, right? And did a couple things, saw how we could use the Chrome developer tools to look back and see the source code of different websites and a lot of really cool and fascinating stuff. So today I want to kind of keep going in line with that conversation and talking about HTML, but introduce more of CSS in the process and talk a little bit more about how we make that connection between an HTML page and CSS. And yeah, so that's the goal. Y'all already know the vibes, live hacking, we out here. If you could do me a favor just to get my energy up and less nervous, give me some reacts in the chat, you know what I'm saying? Let me see some love emojis. Let me see some thumbs ups. Let me see some laughing with crying tears, you know what I'm saying? Like, yeah, there we go. Okay. I feel very loved right now. I feel very loved right now. Let's make this happen. So part of my goal also in just teaching and doing this is less about just like talking to you about it, because you could go Google everything I'm saying, but I also want to show you things like my process for starting a project and little things here and there that will hopefully add to your kind of professionalism when it comes to how you work with projects. And so part of this series, the next two kind of sessions will be project-based. So we'll be working on a project. We won't finish it until the next session, but we'll start it today and have this conversation about HTML and CSS. And yeah, I suggest that you follow along. If you want to try to code alongside, that's up to you, but you have access to the video, so you can always do it afterwards. And yeah, I am excited about this because I think this is really cool to see practically speaking, like, okay, well, why would we need CSS? Why would we need, how do we connect it? Why do we need to connect it? All of those things will be answered in us starting this project together. So first things first, I want to show y'all kind of my flow and format for starting a new project, just to kind of get the ball rolling. So first thing I'm going to do is open up my terminal. And so to do that, first I want to share my screen for y'all, but you know, things. Cool. So I'll open up my terminal. I know it's super small right now. If you can see it, just give me a thumbs up so I know that y'all can kind of follow along with me right quick. Dope. Okay, cool. So the terminal is an application that allows for you to connect to your operating system and to write code, right? So the reason we use the terminal in like the workplace is because it's way faster to type a couple commands in the terminal than actually to go ahead and do a bunch of things with the graphical user interface or the GUI, right? So a lot of professional developers will use the terminal to start projects, to interact with things in their operating system. So it really is a good idea to start getting familiar with it on your computer. If you are on a Mac, terminal would be the app that you'd use. If you're on Windows, command prompt is typically the name of the program that you use. And I think on Linux, it's like the command line or something similarly named. But the idea of what it's doing on all three of those different operating systems is the same, giving you an interface whereby you can put line by line different commands for the computer to process. So what I like to do when I start projects actually is to start with the terminal, right? And so the terminal will always start in like your root directory. And so part of my goal with this, right, is to get you to understand how to understand how the terminal works. You have to understand that the terminal is structured to follow your machine from the root directory of your machine. So the root directory is basically just like your home folder, your home user folder, right? On the command line for Mac, that home root folder, and even on Windows and Linux also is represented by the tilde. So if I were to write a command like pwd, which stands for present working directory, it'll show me the path that I am currently in. So I'm not going to make this a hugely focused on the commands for the terminal right now, but just trying to get you to understand what's going on here. So right now, when I first opened the terminal, I'm in my user folder. So the user of my computer, which in my case is named Camino, that is my user folder, right? So for you, you probably have a folder on your computer that represents like your user data, right? When you first log into your computer, et cetera. In my user folder, I talked about this the last time, I have a folder that I save most of my projects in, right? So if I were to do ls, which is the command to list all of the files inside of a directory, you can see all the different folders in my root, at the root folder in my computer. And the folder that I like to save projects in is a folder called comp. I just named it this and created this folder. And so I always like to start projects by way of creating another folder inside of here that I can use for writing my code and all of this kind of stuff that I would then open in Visual Studio Code. So I'll do that real quick. And inside of, first I'll change directories so that I can go inside of this folder called comp. So the cd command is how you change directories into a new folder. But let's say I didn't have, oh, actually, you'll see that in a second. So first I'll change into this directory called comp, right? So now you see that it's changed to show that the path I'm at now is user/camino/comp, right? So we went from the root to this new folder, right? So when I'm in this folder, right, if I'm on the terminal, I always want to use the ls command to kind of see what's inside of there. All of these are other folders inside of that directory. And we kind of, if you follow along last time, you probably remember that I had those folders inside of there. We actually created this folder last class when we were working on that first that first HTML page that we with the picture and the buttons and everything. So if I want to create a new folder, right? So inside of here, I might want to create a new folder. So what I'm going to do actually is change into this practical HTML folder and start just kind of adding some stuff into there. So first I'll go into this folder. Again, I'll use the cd command to do that. Now that I'm inside this folder, it's just repeating the same thing, right? So I want to ls to kind of just see what's in there. We have two files that are old files from the last time we worked in the project. But what I want to do is create a new folder inside of here for myself to work on this particular project. So what I'm going to do is create a folder. And so the way I'll do that is use the mkdir command, which allows me to create a directory. So this command allows me to make a new folder. So what I'm going to do is name that folder. So we're building a project. I don't want to give it away too fast, so I'm just going to make it sound something more advanced than it actually is. I'm just going to call it T3. So we're going to say mkdir T3, and that's going to create a new folder if I do ls, right, called T3, right? So again, following the same things we've been doing before, just to go inside of that folder, I want to do the change directory command one more time. And now if I do present working directory, you can see I'm inside of that folder I just created, right? I know for some of y'all, it might be your first time seeing the terminal, but overall, if this makes sense and you see me kind of walking through how this went on, just give me a thumbs up so I know you're rocking with me real quick. Dope. Appreciate y'all. Cool. And yeah, we'll have more time to talk about terminal-based project setup. Maybe next time I'll switch it up and do it without the terminal so y'all can see I'm doing very similar stuff. But inside of this folder, typically I like to create this folder in the terminal. And then what I like to do is really cool. I use a shortcut extension that I'll show you how to set up in VS Code that allows me to then open this folder in VS Code. So I could just type code dot, and what that's going to do is open up VS Code on my computer. And when it finally opens, when it finally opens, y'all will see, okay, it's my computer just taking a second. And You know, technology these days. What can I say? What can I tell you? But as you can see, VS Code is kind of trying to load, right? So now it's loading, and you can see our T3 is right here. So this is one way I like to start projects. I made the folder on the terminal, and I open it in VS Code, and then I close the terminal because now I can do most everything in VS Code, right? Another way I could have did this was just like creating the folder and doing everything in VS Code, which maybe we'll take a look at next time we get into the project. But the command that I was showing you that you can use in the terminal to just automatically open folders or open a file even in VS Code is the code command. So code would be a command that comes with VS Code that allows for you to do this work, right? And so in order to get that on your machine, what you're gonna wanna do is in VS Code, if you open up VS Code, you can create a link from your VS Code so that you can use that command in the terminal. To do that, I believe we want to go to, I should have looked at this earlier, but you know, live coding, that's what we do. If you go to view in VS Code in your top bar, right, there's a command called, there should be something called command palette. And the command palette, when you open this, will present a couple options of different commands that you can tell VS Code to run on your behalf. And the one that you want to look for is this one called shell. You can start typing shell if you don't see it immediately. But the one that says shell command, install code command to path. And so this command, right, when you run it, you'll see that it will install, it'll tell you, hey, we installed this script for you that will allow for you to use the code command, much like I did before. And so it's pretty much that simple. Once you do that, then inside of your terminal, you should be able to then use the code command and do really cool stuff in VS Code. So yeah, if you have a question about that, feel free to stick around after, or you know, drop a note in the chat or in the comments, and I'm happy to provide more clarity. But that's not the goal. We got more stuff, more important stuff to get into. But now we have this really cool project folder opened. Part of the reason why I like opening the folder directly in VS Code, like I told y'all last time, is because then now that I have the folder in VS Code, I can, I don't know why it's bugging on me now, but I can, inside of VS Code, I can open a new terminal in VS Code, right? That will automatically take me to that same folder in the terminal. The importance of this, I can't stress enough. When you're working, you want to make sure that you're making commands in the same folder that you're working in, because sometimes if you're not, it might lead to bugs and different errors that you really don't want. And so ensuring that, you know, this name here matches up to the project is really important, right? And the easiest way to do this is make sure you open a folder in VS Code instead of just start working. So we have our folder. That's step one. You know what I mean? So it seems more complicated than it has to be, but at the end of the day, everything has a reason and a purpose. But right now, what we're going to do is we're going to start focusing on this code, right? And getting to a point where we can turn this code into something that will show us more of what we've been talking about, which is HTML, CSS, and stuff in the front end. So last time we talked about how we start HTML projects, and HTML itself stands for the hypertext markup language. I wish that as I talked, like there was like big like subtitles that are like a hypertext transfer language, hypertext markup language, right? Like that would be But the idea is the hypertext markup language is how we create the elements that we would put on our web pages that eventually a browser would show. So HTML is the structure of the sites that we end up creating. And it creates all of those visual building blocks that we need to have on the site. And we talked a lot about that in our last class, right? So typically when we are creating an HTML-based project, we start with a file that is called index.html. So what I'm going to do is just create that index.html file real quick. As you can see, as soon as I put the .html in here, VS Code knew that this file was an HTML file. So another cool reason to use a text editor so that you can have it give you suggestions based on the fact that you're working with a text editor, working with a particular language, excuse me. Okay, so now that we have our HTML file, right? I told y'all last time that HTML is a pretty, HTML on everybody's web pages has pretty consistent themes as to what you have to put in it to get it to show up correctly, right? So every HTML document has a couple elements that are very standard just as part of the how you write HTML. So the first thing is a declaration that says, hey, this is an HTML file, right? And it looks something like this, doc type HTML. So this is just a little declaration that says, hey, this document is an HTML document. And that's always kind of at the top. The next thing that you'll always see in HTML is an HTML element, right? And the HTML element represents the root of the HTML document. We're going to talk a lot more about what that means, root and parent, child, all of that stuff, and why it's important in our next session. But you'll see that at any point in time, knowing what is the root of our document helps us navigate that document to say, hey, which elements are we actually talking about when we're starting to point at specific elements or look for specific elements to do things like styling or do things like adding dynamic programmatic interactions via JavaScript. So every document has an HTML element that represents kind of that document, right? So first we declared that, hey, we looking at a document. Then we declared, oh, this is the document. So hopefully y'all get what I'm saying here. Every HTML document has two elements that are very important. The first one is the head, right? And I love VS Code for just doing this autocomplete of the end of the tag completion. Remember that in HTML, elements are represented with this angle bracket syntax that has the name of the element, and then it contains typically an opening and a closing. Openings typically look like this, where the element itself is just declared in the angles, but the closing tag would look similarly, but with this slash in front that basically says, hey, we're ending that element here. It gets confusing very quickly with HTML because things are nested, but that's why we need closing tags to make sure that elements close where they need to. So the head, we have the opening of the head and we have the closing here. Maybe later we'll enter here and then add some other HTML here. The other element that is very important in all HTML documents is the body, right? So we're going to add the body here. And just like I said before, maybe what we'll do later is add some HTML in here so that we can see stuff. Again, some folks were asking and brought this up earlier, like what's the difference between the head and the body? The head is the element representing all of the metadata for the document. So we'll talk a little bit about what metadata might mean or what kinds of metadata you might want to put in the head so you don't just have it empty. But the body represents the content, all of the visible content that I said visible, but I was trying to say visual and it kind of came out as visual. So if people listen back, they're like, he said that weird. That's exactly what happened. All of the visible content is inside of the body. And so if everything we want to show up on our webpage, we need to put inside of the body just so that it can show up, right? And cool, just with these elements, just like this, by itself, this would be a complete HTML document. It'd be blank, but this is a complete HTML document. So one thing I'll do too, just to kind of start introducing y'all to the workflow that I would practice as well, I would save this HTML. If I'm putting my good programmer hat on, right, I would save this HTML and I would say, this seems like a great place to save my work. So I'm gonna do that real quick. And one way to emphasize how we would go about this professionally is by way of introducing Git, right? So Git, like we talked about before, is just is a software tool that we use to just keep track of our code in different moments in time, different versions of our code. What Git allows us to do is take snapshots of our code at different moments. And much like we would do in like any video game, we can save like almost like we just hit a checkpoint, right? And save your work at that point so that you can always go back to it later. And so you probably might be familiar with Git, and you hear people talk about GitHub. And GitHub is great, but Git is a tool that you can use by itself without GitHub. And I'll show you in this workflow kind of how you would do that as well. So now that we have like a complete file, it is a great place to save our code. I hope you would agree. Give me a thumbs up if you agree. Like, hey, this seems like we have no errors right now. Everything's good. You know what I'm saying? We're feeling like we coasting as programmers, right? Like, you know what I mean? This is the before the storm part, right? So it's a great place to save your work. So to do this and use Git to do this, first you want to make sure you install Git. And we talked about in order to install Git, you just want to go, I'll show you the website real quick. You just want to go to the, to the Git website, which is git-scm.com, right? And it's a very simple process to download Git. As soon as you finish this download wizard, it will install Git on your machine. And just like we did with VS Code, you'll be able to use Git in the terminal as a command. So because I've already installed Git on my machine, I can just do things like run the Git command to check, oh, do I have Git installed, right? And this shows, oh, I do have Git installed at this version, etc. So because I have Git installed, right, and I want to create a snapshot of my code in this particular moment, what I want to do first is initialize a repository inside of this folder. So this is another reason why it's important to have your code. This is another reason why it's important to have your code projects open with folders, because Git works with folders. You want to always remember this. If you put Git in the wrong folder, it might mess up how your Git is working with your project. So you always want to put Git in the folder of the project you want to use Git for. You don't want to put it somewhere else, and you don't want to put it outside of that folder, for lack of better words. I don't know how to say that in a more eloquent professor-like way. But our folder that we're working with for this project is called T3. Remember, we created it very intentionally. So I want Git installed and initialized there. And so really that just happened. You can ignore kind of some of these little warnings and stuff like this, or it is not even a warning. It's just kind of giving us some information about how it's setting itself up. But the most important text here is that it initialized a new repository for us in that folder that we created. The value of having the repository is that now that we have one, we can start making those snapshots and saving our code. So first thing I'm going to want to do is to add the files that I want to snapshot, right? So again, right now this folder only has one file. So if we take a look at it, let me just clear this terminal real quick so it's a little easier to see. If I ls inside of the folder, remember the ls command just lists the files. It just would show the same files here that we have on the VS Code window. But I only have one file, which is this index.html. So technically, the way Git works is I need to add the files I want to save. So the way to do that would be using the git add command. And the git add command allows you to do one of multiple things. First, you could say, I want to add an individual file. So let's say in this case, since there's only one file, I could say something very specific and say, hey, git add index.html, which is the name of this particular file, right? And by doing that, I can then do a command like git status, which is a command you'll see me repeat over and over and over again, because it shows you what's the status of like the snapshot that Git is going to save for us. So here it shows, oh, okay, we had made one file called index.html. Because it's green, it's showing that we added it so that it can be committed in our next save, basically, right? It also tells us a couple other things that are helpful, like, hey, you haven't really made any commits yet. Commits are Git's way of saying, basically, a commit would be like your intent to save something, right? So in order to save your game, right, you need to say, hey, I want to save the game and here's what I want to save, right? So to say, here's what I want to save, we do the git add command. And then to say, I want to save it, that's what a commit would be. So we just said, hey, I want to add this to my saved game. And now I want to commit it so that I can save it actually, right? So after doing the git add command, the other command that you need to do, and we do repeatedly, is to git commit. And commit basically allows for us to specify a new saved version, right? We can add a message to our save, so it's easier to reference back later. And I'll show you why that's important in a second. So for this first commit, I'm just gonna say adding HTML, let's just say adding initial HTML document, right? I feel like that kind of describes what we just did. We just made a new document for HTML and added the base kind of HTML that we need. Just note that the commit message always kind of takes the message in quotes. But once we do this, it says, okay, cool, we just made a new commit and boom, we just saved our game in using Git. And so to kind of talk about why the message is important, one other command that you might want to use when you're using Git in any project is the git log command. So git log will allow for you to see all of the commits that you've made or your team or organization, anybody has made in that Git project. So in this Git project, I'm the only person working on it right now, but you can see that there's this very interesting commit, right? With this very long hashed value. It tells me the author of the commit, which is me. And it also tells you the date it was made, the time it was made, and then here's that message, adding initial HTML document. So you can imagine that if there's multiple commits, right, the only real thing you have here to see what that commit is referring to is that message that we just typed in. So that's why the message is really important. That's why sometimes you hear people say, hey, you have to make good commit messages, et cetera, because that's how a team would structure looking for different files and different moments of the code in different periods of time. If you understand what I'm talking about and you still here, you still awake, give me a thumbs up because that's how I know that y'all with me. Cool, dope. And yeah, so cool. So we made our first commit. That's great. That's a huge step in the right direction. So now that we have this HTML, I think it would be good for us to actually start seeing some stuff and just making sure that the HTML is working as we would expect, right? So we talked about this a little bit last time and just mentioned it a little while ago that in order to do that, we're gonna have to add some code inside of the head and inside of the body, right? Now everything else is good as it just kind of tells us we have a document and here's where the document is defined. But in order to actually have a functioning web page in the sense of seeing things come up on our HTML, we have to add that all of that information into the head and the body of our document. So we're going to start doing that. And in the process, you might start recognizing what T3 is going to be about as we get further and further into the development process. So first, just to confirm that y'all rocking with me and y'all understand what I'm saying, in the chat, I want everybody, even if you see somebody else type it, tell me, what do we put in the head of a HTML website and what do we put in the body? Go ahead, just put it in your own words. What do you remember we put in the head? What do we put in the body? Just drop it in the chat for me. Seeing a lot of really dope answers. And they're kind of spectrum, but everyone's saying similar things, right? In the head is where we put the metadata. Some folks were going as far as to naming some of that metadata, like things like the title, things like other metadata elements, right? And people said in the body is where we put the content. So that's completely right. So we're going to take a look at what that all means right now. So let's do that. Cool. So in this HTML document, we have two very important elements that we got to work with. One is called the head and one is called the body, right? And so VS Code will always show you what each element does if you just kind of hover over it, right? So it says in the head represents a collection of metadata for the document. Okay, not real too sure what that means just off rip, but the body says the body represents the content of the document. That's a little bit easier to work with, easier to understand. So let's start there, right? Let's start with just putting some content into our web page, right? So what I'm going to do first is make just enter, so I have a little bit more space, and I can clearly see the nested nature of this document, because HTML is all about things inside of other things, right? So what I'm going to do first is add some content here that we can then see show up on our browser, etc. So what I will do is I will add a heading, right? We love starting things with text in HTML, right? So remember, a heading is just an HTML element that represents text. It takes text and then shows it up in a particular font size, and that is why it's really helpful, right? So what I'll do here is just kind of hello HTML, right? And save this right now. And we have some element here, right? So it's not enough to just keep typing HTML, right? HTML is a visual, is a very visual thing. So it's very helpful to have HTML to see it, right? As we're coding, to make it so that it's easier for us to kind of just take a look at what's going on there. So I just want to remind y'all how we can do that, right? And there's a couple of ways we can do it, but for the most part, I want to show it to y'all. I'm going to show it to y'all gradually, kind of the different ways we can do this. But first thing I'm going to do is I'd like to just kind of show y'all how, because this HTML file that we have here is on our machine, like it's in a folder somewhere on our computer, we can actually open it in a browser. So if I go to File, Open File in my browser, which I use Brave, you can use Google Chrome, Safari, Mozilla Firefox, Internet Explorer if you're Brave. If I just kind of File, Open File, I don't know, my computer just likes messing with me, I suppose. I don't know why I didn't pop up with anything here. Okay. Let's do this. Let's trick my computer into being a little bit nicer to me. So I'm just gonna open, so I'm just opening a window on my computer to just look through my files, right? And remember, I said that the terminal was representing everything on our computer. So if you look at this window, you might remember, hey, this was like literally like what we saw in a terminal when Cam did the stuff in a terminal, right? Camino is my user folder, my home directory, and inside of there are a bunch of folders. Remember, in the comp folder is where I created our practical HTML folder last time. And today I created this T3 folder. And inside the T3 folder is our index.html, right? I don't know why my browser was tweaking and didn't just let me just file open it like this. So I'm just going to drag it in here and trick it to be smart for a second. And here we go. Here's the file, right? And clearly we can see something. Hello, HTML. You know what I'm saying? Just might want to just dust my shoulder off real quick. I feel lit. I'm like, I did that. You know what I'm saying? I made that HTML, baby. That's me. That's me right there. So now that I have it, remember, one of the cool things that you can do with HTML in the browser is you can use the developer tools on that HTML. So I can open up the elements, and then I should be able to see a correlated HTML source file that kind of shows the same HTML that would be in our source HTML file, which is the file that we're working on in VS Code. So hopefully that makes sense to y'all, right? When you do the inspector and you say view source, you're talking about the base HTML file. Like, it's like, show me the code in the HTML file. But this code in the HTML file that we're looking at right here in the developer tools is literally this file that we have inside of VS Code, right? So we are manipulating the source HTML in VS Code. Typically, when you're looking at the source on the browser, you don't have direct access all the way to like edit it on your machine, but you can edit it through the console because you get to see all of those same files that exist in that actual, you can see all the elements that exist in that file, excuse me. Cool, but the point was to just have this up, right? So I don't really need the inspector, so I'll close that for now. But now, right, I could do a little cool workflow where as I'm making changes here, I could just come back here and refresh and see all of the code as it's kind of working, right? So if I were to say, hey, now I want to add another text element, and I'm gonna just say something like, let's build a game, right? Save this, come back, refresh, and boom, now I can see as I'm working all of the things that are going on at the same time, right? So that's one way we could do this workflow. But again, you're not here because you want to see me do some basic stuff. You're here because you want to see how I would do it, right? You're like, how would you do it though? You ain't gonna do it like that. Like, how would you do it, right? So I'm gonna show you how I would actually do it. And this gets at a little bit more intermediate content, which we'll talk about more detailed how it works in a few sessions. But there's a better way to do this, right? Instead of having to keep reloading everything going on this HTML, I can host my file. Instead of it just being a default file, I can host this file on a server. And by doing that, by going to the server, I should be able to see the changes representing on the file a little bit easier. So again, this is just trying to show you a little bit more about my workflow. You could very easily just do what we were just doing if it makes a lot more sense to you, but just trying to show you some cool little tips and tricks. So in VS Code, right, we talked about the command palette, right? Remember on Vue, we said Vue Go command palette. That's how we installed the code command. But VS Code and other IDEs and text editors have other features to them that make them very worthwhile. One of the ones in VS Code that I love is the fact that it has these extensions. And the extensions in VS Code are basically add-ons that you can add to your Visual Studio Code to make your really just to customize how your VS Code works. So if you go to extensions, it should look like these little building blocks. If you don't see it, you can always just go to Go or where is it? Oh yeah, View Extensions, or you might just have to press these little three dots till you see it show up on your on the side menu here. Once you are in the extensions, it gives you an opportunity to search for different extensions that are basically, like I said, different add-ons that you can add to VS Code that will allow for you to enhance your developer experience. So here's a couple of them that are just being offered for me to use. And here's some of the ones that I think I installed already, right? Here's some more recommended ones, doing all types of stuff. But the one that I like to use when I'm working with HTML, like specifically HTML, CSS kind of stuff, is an extension called Live Server. So I'm just going to type Live Server in here, and there's an extension here called Live Server. It was created by Ritwik Day, and the Live Server, as you can see here, it launches a development local server. Let's just kind of get this back. It launches a development local server with live reload features for static and dynamic pages. Hey, yo, shout out Ritwik Day, you know what I'm saying? Like, cause that's exactly what I want. So I'm gonna click the live server. If I hadn't had it installed, it would show me, hey, install it, but I already have it installed. So that's why it says uninstall, but I could install it, a couple seconds, it installs. And then it gives you the opportunity to then use a live server to host code from a particular folder so that you can more easily edit your sites as you're working with them. So after installing live server, all you kind of really want to do is go back to your project files. This I found is the easiest way to do it. Sometimes, as you can see at the bottom, VS Code has No, just kidding. That's not even the right one. This one. VS Code has shows on the bottom this thing called like run this with the live server. But sometimes I don't see this button. So most times when I want to launch the HTML file in the live server, I just kind of right click on it and you can see this option here, open with live server. So I'm just going to do that. Click that real quick. And it'll start a server on VS Code. And as you can see, a new tab will open on my window. And here is where we can take a look at some of the differences between these two types of methodologies, right? On the first methodology, we had opened a file on our machine, right? And because this is a file, the machine on the browser treats this very statically, right? It's kind of like, hey, you have this file. That's why we have to keep reloading it, because it doesn't know, like, it is just going to open the last instance of the file that you opened, right? So if I edit the file on my machine, in order for the browser to show me that update, I'd have to reload, right? But the difference between that methodology and the Ritwick Day live server way is Ritwick Day created a bit of code that we run in VS Code very easily to launch a server, and the server has the ability to show our file in a development server capability, right? So here, as you can see, the entire URL is different. Instead of it being focused on a file, we're actually back to what we were talking about at the start of our time together, which is hosting using HTTP to transfer files and to host this on a server that gets back sent to the client, right? Remember how HTTP works? There's a client and there's a server. Right now, our machine has a development server up so that we can basically model that interaction with our browser. Here would be, this is our IP address, which for our development server. It comes with a port. And this is the file that we're showing back to the from the server. So again, like I said, a little bit more of an intermediate concept, which we'll talk a whole lot more about within a couple of sessions. But the value of doing this approach, right, is now that I'm using this live server, right, if I start adding some more stuff here, let's just add another H3 to keep the trend going. So keep on keeping on, right? Save this. As you can see, this live server version of the file just automatically updates with the edits, right? So if you think that's cool, you're like, oh, that's dope. I'm glad I saw that. Give me a thumbs up so I know it was well worth all of the energy I put to talking about it. Appreciate y'all.
It was extremely cool.
All right. Okay. Cool. So we got the live server up. That's great. This is going to help our workflow a lot more. So this is typically how I work when I'm starting to do HTML-based stuff, right? I create my file in VS Code, I set it up, and then I just kind of keep it up with the live server so that I can see the changes as I'm making them. And this is going to help us kind of just streamline a lot of our development experience. So let's actually build out the HTML that we're going to need for our specific T3 application. Y'all are kind of like, what is this T3 thing? Why he ain't just telling us what it is? You'll see what it is in a second. Cool. So first thing I want to do is I want to just kind of really structure this based on how we're actually going to have this set up. So we are going to keep some of this text. I don't actually need this H3 for now. But what I will do is just take this, and for now, I'm just gonna say T3, and then later y'all see what it is, and you'll be like, okay, he was overhyping this, but we could have he could have did this a little bit easier. And I'm gonna just say it's your turn. All right, we're building a game, right? T3 is the name of the game. It's your turn is a good instruction for the start of the game. Right. So cool. So we got stuff on the body. I feel like we're pretty good, confident, and like, okay, we're going to just keep adding HTML in the body. But folks have been asking, like, what are the types of things that we would put in the head, right, of a HTML page? And again, the head is normally where we put a lot of metadata, right, and different things that the page needs to know about that doesn't revolve around elements in the HTML that we want to see as content, right? So I'm just going to show y'all a couple elements that are typical that you might see in the head. These aren't, I'm not saying that every web page has this, but I'm saying these are typical elements that you would see in the head, right? And so just like some of your classmates shouted out, one of the elements that are really common to see in the head as metadata is the title, right? So if we use the title tag in the head, it says the title element, let me just pull this for myself. The title element represents the document's title or name, right? So we use this so that we can show people what is the name of this document that they're looking for, right? So right now, as you can see, we don't really have a name for this document, but look at how Git has this really beautiful Git. This is the website is Git. This is what it is, right? We kind of want something like that at our title typically on our browser. Whoops, my bad. And so the title here, and this is where I'll probably go ahead and just kind of show y'all what's going on here. I'm just gonna say, give this away a little bit. T3 stands for tic-tac-toe. Y'all were like, oh, I thought it was something sophisticated. Nah,
I thought you were gonna make us make TikTok.
Oh no, hey. Okay, your assignment by Wednesday, build TikTok now. Yeah, no, I ain't like that. I ain't gonna do y'all like that. We build a tic-tac-toe. It's so much easier. But yeah, we build tic-tac-toe, right? So it's nice to have our title of our page to show people this, right? So at the end of the day, the title element is a great element to use in your head to show, hey, this is what this page is about, right? So the value of the title element is to change the title of your page, and that changes what shows up on the browser tab. So that's one cool thing that we like to use in the head. Another thing that comes up often in the head is there's two other things that we'll talk a little bit about. One thing that comes up often in the head, because this is what it's about, this is what it's for, is meta tags and metadata, right? And meta tags are elements that represent all kinds of different metadata that we can put into our site, right? Things that just help the site understand a little bit more about itself. And there's just a lot of different types of metadata that a site can have. One thing that I'll shout out right now, because it's actually a great opportunity to do it, is that in VS Code, it's pulling this information about HTML from the Mozilla Developer Network. And so give me a thumbs up if any of y'all have ever heard of Mozilla before. Like Mozilla.
Firefox.
Yeah, right. So Firefox is the browser that Mozilla's created, but Mozilla itself is an organization that's focused on the web, right? So Mozilla Developer Network is a great source of information for all things related to the web, right? So by using the Mozilla Developer Network link that the VS Code gives you, it'll take you directly to the docs on those particular elements, which gives you way more information than just a little blurb in VS Code, right? So here we can see a little bit more about the meta tag, right? So it says the meta element represents metadata that cannot be represented by other elements like style, script, title, etc. So these are also elements that can exist in the head, right? Because these are all metadata, like it's saying. This is all metadata, but it's metadata that can't be represented in these types of metadata. So here we're getting a cool glimpse at other metadata that we might see in a bit in our site. But some of the things that get added in there are listed here, right? So it tells us about a couple different types of elements. So it says the meta element can have different types of, can describe different types of data. And all of that data is described via the attributes that tag has. So we'll go back in a second and talk a little bit more about attributes, but the metadata can describe things like the character set, like what encoding of characters is the document using, right? It could say things like name, which is more about describing kind of things across the HTML document that will apply to the entire page of that document. Here's a little bit more attributes that you can describe with the metadata, with the meta tag. But then I guess to show you this in a little bit more of a practical example, I like to go look at more established websites that give a better glimpse at what kinds of metadata would you use in certain cases. There's not a lot of sites that are like both professional and kind of lightweight, right? Like if you go to the New York Times, remember there's like all types of HTML in there, so it's hard to read. So one website, I'm just giving y'all hacks. Like y'all better give me some love on the chat right now. You know what I'm saying? Give me some love because I'm just giving y'all I'm giving y'all all the sauce right now. I need y'all to go and tell a friend that I just give the sauce for free. You know what I'm saying? What is this? But one thing I like to do when I'm like trying to just remember like a good structure of sites is look for professional sites that are like lightweight in what they're doing, so it's easy to read the HTML, but they're professionally built, and you know you can trust that whoever built this knows what they're doing, right? So who better to look at than Google, right? Google knows what's good, you know what I'm saying? So let me go to the Google homepage and just see, because I was going to do a different site, but the Google homepage is pretty decent. Let's look at the source here and just take a look at what's going on in their HTML. They might have a lot of crazy HTML. They do in this particular one. So not as good as an example, but Google is owned by a company, right, called Alphabet, and Alphabet is typically a great reference to like kind of see things about Google. Well, this is actually a different site. Let's look at the Google About page. Maybe it's a little bit less crazy. But you know, Google wants to get all that data from us, so maybe they make things a little hard. Nope, this is better, right? This is better. This is a little not as crazy, right? We can scroll in one place and see everything in here. So this actually is decent. So if we look at the HTML element, right? Remember, we have the doc type here. We have HTML to start the document. And then inside of the head, you can see a couple of different types of elements that Google is using on their About page, right? So there's a script tag, which maybe you could just ascertain what that does. It allows us to run some JavaScript. But we also see things like this meta tag, like in the meta tag describing the character set, like UTF-8. So UTF-8 is a particular character encoding, which basically means like what characters or like, you know, little things on your keyboard were used to describe what's on this page, right? And there's different types of characters that different around the world and different kinds of computers that people might use. But UTF-8 is kind of a standard one. The title, right? We see the title here, another meta tag describing a description from the page. And so this is saying, hey, the description of this page, stay up to date with Google company news and products and discover stories and all this, that, and the third, right? Here's just a good example of a meta tag that was really just describing more about the site, right? And this type of meta tag is what people use to do things like search engine optimization, right? Add meta tags with descriptions and give some keywords that will help the site rank on social search engines, right? Google is the boss at search engines, so there you go, right? But these would be kind of some of the things that we might expect to see in the head, right? Also, we see this one, which is another meta tag that's describing the viewport. And the viewport is basically kind of just describing more about how the whole document's, what's the whole document's kind of visual scale, right? And so gives just some information about the scale of the site page and stuff like this. So just to kind of show y'all, this is kind of like default stuff. I'm going to just take that character set UTF-8 because we're also coding our page with similar text, similar characters. The viewport is just kind of a good one to have for describing the scale and the size of our page. And then we already added our title, but maybe I might add a description one, right? So just take these, go back to our little drawing and say, okay, cool. You know what I'm saying? Let me add some meta tags. Boom. Now I got a couple meta tags in there. And if I want to be fancy and just rank on the search engines, I could do name equals description, right? And so what I'm doing here is adding a new tag, right? And as you can see, the open angle describes the name of the tag, but then there's these interesting little data points inside of the HTML. Give me a thumbs up if you can see what I'm talking about, right? Here we see this like the opening tag, right, with the name. And then here we see like kind of like a data point, right? There's an equal sign and something here, right? This is called an attribute. And in HTML, attributes are super important. We use attributes to pass information into the HTML that allow for it to do its job, right? So with the meta tag, if you remember in the Mozilla documents, it was saying that based on the different attributes that you pass in to the meta tag, it changes what kind of metadata is going to be looked at, right? So it kind of details a little bit more here, and you can read a little bit more about that there. But the attributes for the meta tags are super important, right? Oops. So here, defining the character set tells this meta tag, hey, you're working around the characters of this document. The meta tag with the name attribute tells this metadata, hey, you're describing information, what does it say here? Information providing document level metadata applying to the whole page, right? And so all of those attributes are really important. So again, we're using the name one to do this kind of mirror the Google, mirror the Google about page information and just kind of add a little description for our sites. So I'm just going to say description. And then as you can see, there's another attribute called content, and that is where I put the actual body of the data. So what's cool about the VS Code is it'll also tell you some more about those attributes if you hover over the attribute name. So it says this attribute defines the name of a piece of document level metadata, and it is also associated with value in the content, right? So that's why we have these two attributes here. So in the content, I'm going to say an amazing game designed to help the world learn some HTML. So there you go, cool. Remember, I gotta close this meta tag, and this is actually really interesting, right? Here, you can see that this looks like an opening tag, right? Well, what's going on here? Does the meta tag kind of not work the way that we would expect those other tags to work? And it kind of looks like so. Sometimes in HTML, there's certain tags that are what we call self-closing, which means that the tag itself closes in one line. You don't have a corresponding closing tag. And I think that's because if you look at it, the meta tag really defines all of the information in the attributes, right? It doesn't nest any information. So if we look at the title, for instance, the title is saying, hey, I'm a title tag. I'm a title element. I'm going to show a title. But then we put some text in between the opening and the closing. So the title needs kind of like HTML nested in it to work properly, right? And so often when we need to nest elements, so another way for us to have this title so we could see the nesting a little bit better would be something like this, right? So the title opens, it takes some text as a child, and then it closes, right? So this is typically how most HTML elements work. You open the HTML element, you put the data inside on its own kind of line, and then you close it, right? But in the case of elements like meta, right, where everything kind of happens inside of the attributes, you don't really nest anything. So what happens is these elements typically are self-closing. So sometimes you'll see a self-closing element like just like this, kind of like you with the opening tag looking syntax, but sometimes you'll also see it with like a slash to represent that it's also closing as well. So I'm just keep it how it is, but just bringing that up. We're going to see some more self-closing elements as we keep hacking and working on what we're working on. Cool. So we have some metadata in here. We have the meta tags. We have some doing some description stuff. We have our title. So if we go back to our little browser thing, look how none of that last 40 minutes or whatever that was of me doing metadata stuff changed anything on the body, right? That's the big point I was trying to make. So cool. So dope. So we have a nice set of data in the head. We have a good amount of starting data in the body. So what I'm gonna do is actually take this opportunity to save one more time and just kind of make another Git commit just to keep y'all on your toes. So remember to do this, I just want to take a look. First thing I like to do when I'm doing Git commits is just Git status to take a look at what's changed. So this is why Git is really helpful, right? So since we added Git in our project, every time we do Git status, we'll see what files in our project have been modified. And if a file's been modified, it's a good chance that what we're going to want to do is to save that file because it just got changed, right? So that's exactly what we're going to do. So what I'm going to do is do git add. Remember, we have to always add the files we want to save. So I'm going to say git add, and because again there's only one file in here, I'm going to say add index.html. If I do git status one more time, you can see that now it's showing it green. Hey, we're staged, that file's ready to go. We're good. So now I'll just do a git commit -m, and inside of here, I'm gonna say adding title and other metadata to head. And I think that's a good description of kind of where we ended up here. So cool, I have another commit in here. And then again, if I were to go and look at the log, I can see all those commits that I've made, meaning that if I want to go back to the old version, I can, but now I have this other version of the game that I could go back to as well. Cool. So let's keep hacking just to kind of speed things along a little bit and keep building out our tic-tac-toe game now that we know that this is what we're building. So first thing I'll do, I should probably just kind of get this going so we know what's going on. And first thing I'm gonna say is instead of your turn, just say X's turn. So cool. This should update on the server. Boom. Tic-tac-toe, it's X's turn. Let's go. Let's go. All right. So y'all know the vibes. Tic-tac-toe is a game. If you're not familiar, tic-tac-toe is a game in which we basically create a board. Let's just take a look at this, and so y'all can see. Tic-tac-toe is kind of focused on a board that we create that is a grid. I don't know why Brave is tweaking. That's very interesting. Brave is like, I don't know what tic-tac-toe is. Okay, let's go to Google then. All right, like, okay, you want to play games? All right, I get it. I get it. Tic-tac-toe, right? So tic-tac-toe is all about a board that we create, and in that board, we're able to, that's kind of cool that you could play tic-tac-toe by typing it in Google. That's kind of lit. But basically, right, tic-tac-toe starts with this game board, right? And this game board, we have provide a space for users to mark different turns in their, as they're playing, right? So each player takes an individual turn, and one is represented as X, one's represented as O. And what happens is that each player has one opportunity to play each round, and whoever gets 3 in a row first is the winner, right? So you could either get 3 in a row this way, or diagonally like this, and then you can win, right? So in order for us to go ahead and start making tic-tac-toe even a reality, we need to actually create that board, right? And so again, this is kind of just meant to be an example of like, how does all of this stuff work together, right? So clearly, if we want to do something on the web page, we need some HTML. So let's start there and like try to create some HTML that will represent this. So HTML is very interesting, right? Because there's no HTML that's just like a box, a square. Like you can't, it's not that specific, right? But there are certain elements that you can use to represent those concepts in HTML a little bit more formally. One great element for us to take a look at that does this very well is an element called a div. So scroll up here in the docs for the Mozilla website, take a sip of water casually. Hope nobody notices that I'm taking water. Puts the water down casually, hopes nobody thinks that he just drank some water. But the div is a element that we use in HTML as kind of like a container, right? You see, it says it here, a container for content. So we use divs in HTML. Like, I think it's good to think about like a div is a box, but it's an HTML box, and you can put HTML in the box, right? Like that's basically what a div is useful for. And so we use divs to organize content. We use divs to actually be like a box that we can do things to. But divs are really cool because with a div, you can use CSS and other properties to help you structure the HTML in a more container-based approach. So divs are a really great HTML element to just be familiar with, especially as you're starting to try to make your code a little bit more organized. So our goal right now is to build a little tic-tac-toe board for ourselves, right? And as you can see, it's kind of made up of these little squares. So first thing I think we should do is try to make a square, like a box for our game, right? So let's do that. And let's do it in HTML, and we'll see why in a second. We're gonna need some more than just HTML to do it. So cool, so I have some of these visual elements here. First thing I wanna do is I just wanna get a little square to show up here. And so like I said, there's no good element that's just like a square, right? That would be super dope, but there's not. So we have to use the HTML that we have access to do that a little bit more specifically. So what I'm gonna do is, like I said, I'm gonna use a div, because a div, a div is, oh wait, no, that was the right thing, I'm tweaking. A div is a great element to use to start structuring in like a box. So what I'm gonna do is just create a new div, right? So a div is just created very similarly, just open an element. It says a div has no special meaning at all. Wow, I feel like a div sometimes. No, I'm just kidding. I know I'm special. A div has no special meaning at all. It represents its children, and it can be used with different attributes to just change things and do some stylistic stuff. So that's cool. We're just gonna use this as a box. So boom, I think this div will do the job for us. I'm gonna save it, and nothing shows up. Wow, that's just fantastic, right? Well, why is nothing showing up? Is nothing showing up? Let's actually check, right? So I'm gonna open up this inspector, and then we're gonna take a look and see something about divs that's really interesting, right? So cool, we see our source code, we get the body. Remember that what's cool about the Chrome developer tools is that we can hover over different elements, and it should tell us and show us those elements. So cool, we see the H1, we see the H2, and then here's this div. Well, clearly there's something there, right? But what? Nothing's showing up, right? Well, that's very interesting. And that goes back to what VS Code was just telling us. A div is not really going to show you anything. That's what it means by it has no special meaning. It's not going to do anything. It reflects the elements that we're going to put inside of the div. So if I like enter here, and inside of this div, I'm going to say, this is text inside of a div, right? Now, when the page reloads, we see some text. Okay, that's cool. But then if we go back to the developer tools, right, we can see that the div now is showing up with the text inside of it. So the div is kind of just like a box around this text. Now that text I just kind of typed out, right? But this text could be anything. I could put this in an H1, right? And then what that would do is just kind of have this div a little bit different, right? The text inside of it at least will be a little bit different, right? So I could put it as a paragraph element, right? And a paragraph element is another element that we use for text, right? So the div is just kind of a container for whatever I put in there, right? So that's what they were saying when it says it has no special meaning at all. But that's great, because we can use this div as kind of just like a box, right? But as you can see, if we keep the div alone by itself, nothing really shows up there, right? Though it is there, right? It doesn't really show up with anything. And this starts to show us kind of a bit of where the line starts to blur. Because HTML is responsible for you saying, I want an element on my page, right? I want a div on my page. I do want a div on my page, but I want the div to look a certain way, right? Well, that's no longer the job of HTML. That is the job of CSS, right? And CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. And that is that's what we use in order to style different elements in HTML, right? So a CSS file is used often in combination with HTML to not only provide just the structure of a site, but also the style of that site. So there's a really cool example of this on the W3 schools. I just want to show it to y'all real quick, because I think this is a very poignant description of like, hey, you use HTML to do everything for structure, but then the CSS kind of then becomes what the CSS becomes the thing that changes that HTML, no matter what the structure is. So let's see. I just need to find it real quick because, okay, cool. So here it is. I love this example. Shout out to W3 schools. Shout out to people who work open source on the web. You know what I'm saying? Y'all are real MVPs out here. So this is a CSS demo. It says one HTML page, multiple styles. So it says, here we will show one HTML page, display it with 4 different style sheets. So basically what this is saying is they have one index.html file. They have one HTML. It's the same HTML. They're not changing anything in HTML. But what they're changing is the styles. And take a look at how crazily different just the styles can make a page look, right? With the same code. So first, we have this style sheet 1. A beautiful style sheet with a nice box layout across certain parts of it. You know what I'm saying? We see this nice green little header, see this nice blue sidebar, beautiful, right? We also have style sheet 2, a nice little more vibrant style sheet, if you will. Very orange, for lack of better words. it's giving pumpkin. It's giving Thanksgiving. It's giving, I just love this color, you know what I mean? And as you can see, though, the elements of this page are literally saying and achieving similar things, but the things that are different are where they're positioned in this page, right? So we go back to style sheet 1, same text, same kind of links here, same thing here, right? But style sheet 2, completely different, right? Completely different. One more time for sake, style sheet 3, right? A whole different vibe here, right? Where in style sheet 3, we're kind of getting a little bit more minimal, I would say, you know, like a little bit, we got these boxes kind of just floating with the opportunity for us to click on them, a nice little hover effect over them. Very beautiful, very beautiful. And style sheet 4, oh, wow. It's giving kind of I'm a hacker kind of vibe, you know. It's giving like Matrix. I'm seeing Neo, getting Trinity out of this. Like very beautiful style sheet, if I say so myself. That sidebar element still there, but it's represented in a completely different way. And here, let's just take a look at the regular HTML that all of this is built off of, right? So all this HTML file with no style can turn into this HTML file. This HTML file, right? The web page can become completely different based on the styles that you use. I think CSS is amazing. But as you can probably start to imagine, creating all of these different styles is just as sophisticated of work as coming up with just like, what is the structure that we're gonna need in general, right? So that being said, it's not enough just to have the elements on HTML. We're going to need to add some styles sometimes to make it so that those elements are represented in a certain type of way, right? We can pause, drink some water. All right, cool. So back to our thing in this div and how this is all going to work. So in general, right, we create HTML to be the structure, but we need to also have some connected CSS to help us in visually showing that thing in the way we want. So I can have a div. A div is a great element because it's so flexible. You literally can use a div to do anything. And well, anything in quotes. Do not want to give you straight wrong developer advice, but you can use a div for a lot of different things, and especially when it comes to stylistic things on your web page. So what we're going to do here is going to take a look at how we might use CSS to make this div actually show us the square that we need to then create our board. So in order to do that, first thing I want to do is we're going to pause for a second on our HTML, and I'm going to actually create a new set of things inside of this project folder. First thing I'm going to do, and this is just because, right, I'm showing you my workflow. I'm going to create a folder in here called CSS, and this CSS folder is typically just a folder that I might have in my projects that holds different style sheets, because maybe I have multiple ones and I just want to store them in one place. So that's why I'd have this folder. But inside of this folder, I can right click, create new file, and inside of this folder, I'm going to create a new file called style.css. And as you can see, VS Code recognizes that this CSS file is a CSS file. And now I can write some CSS in here. So CSS has a very interesting format to it, where we call the formats of CSS rules, right? CSS describes rules that are going to describe what needs to happen visually in our code. The CSS rule is broken up into two parts, a selector and then a declaration, right? The selector basically says what HTML elements are going to be changed by this CSS. It selects certain HTML elements. Then the declaration says, give those selected elements these things, right? So for this particular one, it's selecting H1 elements, and it's saying for any H1 elements we can select, give them these properties, right, and values. It's important to know that CSS doesn't just work only with one element. It can also be used to select groups of elements. And so we'll take a look at that as we start writing out our own CSS in a second. So what might I want to do? Well, I have this div here and I want to style that div creatively. So maybe what I'll do is use the CSS to select the div and then take the div and then maybe do some stylistic things to it that can make it a little bit more helpful, right? So what I'll do is back in our code, let's do that. So first things first, I want to just select an element, and just to kind of make sure that this is going to work, let's just start with this H1. Let's just literally do the same one because we have an H1 element in our thing. I'm going to say color blue like it did here, and then font size. Let's just do color blue just for now because I don't really care about changing the font size. So CSS selector, declaration, cool things that you might want to know. If you hover over a selector in VS Code, it will show you what elements will come back to be changed by that selector. So this is clearly saying any H1 element we see in our HTML will be changed. If you hover over the value or the property, it'll tell you what that property does. So here you can see, here you can see that the color property changes the color of an element's text, right? And then here, with colors, you can use the little slider to get a different color if you want. I think that's always really cool. So cool. So this is CSS, functional CSS. But if I save this, right, and go back to our little page, we don't see the H1 turn blue. Well, why is that? Well, that's because right now the HTML file that we're working with has no idea about this CSS. It's not connected to the CSS in any way, shape, or form. So just because the CSS is inside this folder does nothing for this HTML file. In order to create a connection between your CSS and your HTML, you need to link them, right? There's a couple of ways you can do styles in HTML. We could have all the CSS described in this HTML file, but that just becomes really long and messy, right? Now you have HTML elements with style elements, all this kinds of stuff that gets a little bit hard to read. So I like to go the route of having a separate CSS file. Also, one of the benefits of doing it this way is anytime I want to change something, I know exactly where I need to go to change it. Versus if I have the styles inside the HTML right here, it could just get really complicated finding what I need to change at different moments. So if I want to connect the CSS file to a HTML document, I do that with help of a very helpful element that we normally put in the head of the HTML, which is a link element. I don't know why I did this. A link element. And the link element also is a self-closing element. And the link element is responsible for linking different documents to other resources, right? So what we want to do is link this HTML document contained in this HTML, right, to our CSS file. So the way to do that, the link element, and sometimes when you're working with a new HTML element, you might want to look up the docs for it so you can see, how do I declare this the right way, right? So here, if we go to the link element, it says the HTML link element shows the relationships between documents and certain things, most commonly used to link to style sheets, right? So this is really helpful. It also says, hey, but sometimes you do it to set icons and other stuff. So good to know. And then it shows us this example where we link, it looks like the link takes a couple attributes, one called href and one called rel, which is described a little bit more here, right? So it says, hey, the attributes for href and rel are used to create a relationship for your link element to a specific file, right? Href would represent the path to the file. Rel is the relationship that that file has to your document. So it tells you here that there's a couple different types of relationships that you might establish. One is for like icon. One could be for different, mostly it's saying like other icons and things like this, but we also use it to describe things like our CSS files and stuff like that. So this is why it's helpful to just read about these things on the docs, because you'll learn a lot more than just kind of what you see just on what the default solution is, right? So let's just create a link to our HTML or to our style sheet with a similar bit of code like so, right? So we have to use the href attribute to describe the path to our CSS file, and we got to declare the relationship. So in here, going to do that. So I'm going to say href equals, equals, and inside of here, we got to put the path to a particular file that this HTML can refer to. So because they're all in the same project folder, it's typical that we'll start this with a slash to say inside of this folder of a project, right? Current folder, I want to go into this CSS folder, right? And inside that CSS folder is a file called style.css. And this would be then how this HTML could reference this CSS file to use inside of itself. Then I want to say that the relationship is one of a style sheet. Whoops, I forgot to close this with another quotation mark. And boom. So now we have a link to a specific style sheet. So if I save this now and go back to our app, it's reloading the server, and boom, our H1 is now blue because now this CSS is applying itself to that particular HTML file, right? Cool, so this is great. This is actually a great place for us to take a little pause and just make sure we save some stuff. So now, right, if I clear this and I go back up here and I kind of just do git status to take a look at what's changed. So Git's like, okay, a couple things have changed. You changed that HTML file that we were looking at before, but we have these new files that we haven't seen yet, these folder of CSS and the style sheets that are inside of it. So I want to add these things to be tracked with Git. So this next save holds all of those things. So what I'm going to do is I want to do a Git add, right, again. But now that there's multiple files, just doing like one by one can get a little tedious. So typically what I like to do when I have multiple files is just say, hey, add everything that is in there in the folder, right? So add anything that is inside of here, inside of our project folder, right? So our project folder now has a couple more files. So by using the dot shortcut, you're saying add everything inside of our project folder. This is a quick shortcut to just say, hey, add everything inside of this folder. So by doing this, and then doing git status one more time, we should see that both now the index.html as well as that CSS file and folder are being tracked with Git, which is great. So now that I've added it, remember to save the game, I need to add what I want to save, and then I want to save it. So I'm going to do git commit -m, and here I'm going to say connecting HTML to CSS, right? So now that I'm connecting the HTML to CSS, right, I can just do this commit right quick. And like I told y'all before, the value of this is now, if I do a git log, I can see all of these different saved games, right? I got the first one, and I can use the down arrow to see more. I have this first one where I added the document, the second one where we added all this metadata to the head. Now we have this one where we're connecting the HTML to the CSS, which is great. So last thing we want to do is really kind of just get that square showing up. And if we can do that, then I think we're going to be in a good place. So like I talked about first, right, we have this div here, and this div is kind of just just kind of floating, right? And we just want to make sure that we can take this div and turn it into a square for our game. So the thing about the way that divs work is we need to style them for it to show things, right? So there's a couple ways that we can approach this. And ultimately, though, what we want to do is just to see this div kind of look like a square, right? And so the cool thing is, like, now that we've connected this to CSS, it'll be pretty easy to do this if we can target this div in a unique way. So let's just do kind of like we did before and just kind of put another div selector, right? So we're gonna say, hey, find a div element, right? And inside of this selector, we can give it some rules. So the rule we'll give it is, first, let's just kind of show this div a little better. So I want to, in order to make a div stylized, just to save y'all some time as we're talking about this, you want to give it some height, some width, and then that also you can then start to see it a little better. Because remember, divs will only show, they'll take the size of the elements that you give them, but we can style them in specific ways to do things like have a height and a width. So let's just do that real quick. So we'll use the height property to say, okay, I'm going to give this a height of 140 pixels. Remember, in CSS, every declaration ends with a semicolon, right? So we have give it a property, the value, and the semicolon. So we're going to give it a width of also 140 pixels, right? Because we want it to be a square. And if I save this, right, remember the live server is already kind of hooked up, editing this stuff with us. And then if I go to the developer tools, take a look at this div, right? Now we can see that it's highlighting this div and there's actually something there. We can't really see it still, but you can see that now by clicking on this div, we actually have something there that actually does look like a square. So all we got to really do now is to kind of see this better. So one way to do this is to just give it a background color, right? Because clearly there's something there that's 140 pixels by 140 pixels, but we want to see it more visibly on the screen. So I could do something like give it a background color, but for the case of the game that we're going to build, I'm just going to actually give it a border. So I'm going to say border, and we're going to set the border to be like 2 pixels. So some CSS gives us, we have to declare multiple values for it to work. So the border is actually a CSS that takes in a couple different options. So it says, hey, you give it line width, line style, and color, or color, right? So in order to do this, I got to give it those 3 values. So I'm going to say 2 pixels for the line width. I'm going to say the type of line would be solid. And then I want it to be a little bit just like kind of like black, right? Like a little black border here. Put a semicolon to close that rule. And cool. Now we have that div looking like a square, right? So this is great. Like that div will represent kind of the square. And then ultimately what we want to do to make tic-tac-toe a little better is have 9 squares, right? And then if you can imagine what's going to happen if we have 9 squares, is it's going to kind of look like this, one of these 2 things, like this blue one here, where we got a nice little box around the game, or like this little red one here, where we have a nice little box around our 9 squares. So cool. So now that we have our squares, our first square showing up, the last thing that is really kind of important to do here is to save the game, right? So I'm going to just do that real quick, go back to VS Code. And now that we kind of have something kind of as a finalized space to stop for now, just going to go back into the console, just git add everything, git commit -m, and I'm going to say creating our first game square, and make sure I spell it right. Cool. And yeah, so now that that's done, I can git log and I should see another commit for that. There it is. Cool. So all of that's there. So all that's left to do now is to do some more stylistic work and some more HTML work to add those 9 squares to the game board. Of course, I could do some more of it now, but we're kind of coming up at time. So I'm gonna just pause here and we'll continue it on next time we link. So just to recap what we did today, we started a new project that's going to turn out to be a tic-tac-toe game. In order to do any web project, we create an index.html file where in the index.html file, we can describe the elements that are going to come up in this document. So every HTML document follows a simple structure of declaration and then the HTML document tag that kind of describes the document. Inside of that, we have nested in there a head and a body. Both of those elements represent data for the HTML page. The head represents metadata. Some of those things might include things like meta tags that describe the character set or describe the viewport of the page or describe just different text about the page as a description. It might include things like a title, it might include things even like a link to other files that this page might use, right? And then the body is all about kind of the visual elements, the things that we want to see, right? And the body would show us all of these visual elements in ways that we can say, cool, like here's all the elements that I want to show up here. And what's great about HTML is that we can create a very good structure of a page, but the structure is just the beginning. And every time after you've created the structure, you're going to want to create some type of stylistic work on top of that structure to create the page that you want to show up the way that you want it to see, like the way you want to see it, right? And so with one very basic HTML page, right, with HTML elements, we can style those elements in completely different ways using CSS. And so our goal was to use our knowledge of HTML to just start the process of building this game board. But in the next couple of sessions, we'll continue to do this work and then start to make it functional. So thank y'all for your time and y'all